Sometimes the most profound connections happen between the most unlikely people. When loss leaves us feeling broken and alone, we never expect healing to come from a stranger who looks nothing like us. Buck Hanley, a weathered 62-year-old rancher, has spent years nursing old wounds and pushing people away. Maya, a grieving teenager sent to live with relatives after her mother's death, carries her own burden of pain and mistrust. Their worlds collide on a dusty Montana ranch when Buck sarcastically challenges Maya to ride his most dangerous Mustang, never believing she'd accept. But sometimes life has other plans. What begins as a moment of cruel jest becomes something neither saw coming, a summer that would change them both forever. Can two broken souls find healing through an untamed horse in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound ledger sat on Buck Hanley's kitchen table like an unwelcome guest. Its pages yellowed with decades of ranch records, debts, and disappointments. Each morning, Buck opened it with the same reluctant ritual, running his weathered fingers down columns of numbers that told the story of 3 generations of Hanley men who had worked this land. His father's precise handwriting filled the earlier pages, entries dating back to 1952, when the old man had first purchased the ranch with dreams. Bigger than the Montana sky, Buck poured black coffee into a chipped mug and studied the latest entries. The numbers hadn't improved overnight as much as he'd willed them to. Feed costs up again. Veterinary bills mounting. The mortgage payment due in 2 weeks with no clear path to making it. At 62, Buck had expected to be handing this place over to his son by now, not staring down the barrel of foreclosure. The silence in the kitchen felt heavy, broken only by the tick of the wall clock his ex-wife Sarah had chosen 25 years ago. She'd said it reminded her of her grandmother's house, where time moved slowly and families gathered for Sunday dinners. Buck wondered if she still thought about those early years, before his stubbornness and pride had driven a wedge between them that eventually became an impossible chasm. Outside, the June morning stretched across the valley like a golden promise. The crazy mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the advancing summer. This land had once sustained 3 families, his grandfather's generation when the cattle industry was booming, when a man could make an honest living working the earth with his hands and treating his animals with respect. Buck stepped onto the porch, his boots echoing on the weathered boards. The ranch house needed paint, the barn roof wanted fixing, and half the fence posts were leaning like old men, tired of standing upright. But the land itself remained beautiful, rolling pastures that turned emerald in the spring rains and golden in the autumn light. His grandfather had chosen well, even if his descendants had struggled to live up to the promise of the place. Morning. Buck. Pete's voice carried across the yard as the 70-year-old foreman emerged from the barn, moving with the careful gait of a man whose body had absorbed decades of hard work. Pete had been with the ranch for 40 years, longer than Buck's marriage had lasted, longer than his children had lived under this roof. If loyalty could pay the bills, Buck reflected, they'd be the richest outfit in Montana. How are they looking this morning? Buck asked, referring to the small herd of cattle that represented the ranch's primary source of income. 23 head, down from the 150 his father had run in the good years. Restless, Pete replied, adjusting his worn hat against the strengthening sun. Probably smell that storm coming in from the west. You see the clouds building over the peaks? Buck squinted toward the mountains, noting the dark smudges gathering on the horizon. June in Montana meant afternoon thunderstorms that could bring relief or destruction, depending on their mood. We'll get the herd moved to the lower pasture before noon. Already on it, Pete said, which was his way. The older man had developed an instinct for what needed doing before Buck had to ask. It was a comfortable rhythm they'd developed over the years. 2 men who understood each other's silences and respected each other's space. As they walked toward the barn, Buck's attention was drawn to the far pasture where a dark shape moved against the fence line. The Mustang, Even at this distance, the horse's defiant posture was unmistakable. Head high, muscles coiled, ready to bolt at the first hint of human approach. Buck had found the stallion 3 years ago during a winter storm, half dead from cold and hunger, his dark coat matted with ice. The horse had recovered his strength, but never his trust. Every attempt to gentle him had ended in failure, sometimes spectacular and dangerous failure. 2 professional horse trainers had declared him unbreakable. One had suggested putting him down as a liability. But something about the Mustang's spirit reminded Buck of himself, damaged, isolated, but refusing to surrender. "That horse is going to hurt somebody someday," Pete observed, following Buck's gaze. "Or hurt himself trying to get over that fence." "Maybe," Buck acknowledged. "Or maybe he just needs the right person to understand him." Pete gave him a sideways look. "You've been saying that for 3 years. Horse doesn't want to be understood. He wants to be left alone." There was truth in that, Buck knew. The Mustang had carved out his own territory in the far pasture, accepting the shelter and feed Buck provided, but maintaining his distance from human contact. It was an arrangement that suited them both. The horse received care without surrendering his independence, and Buck could watch the animal's magnificent defiance without forcing an unwanted relationship. The barn smelled of hay and horses, leather and the faint sweetness of grain. Buck had spent countless hours in this space, finding solace in the routine tasks of caring for animals. Horses didn't judge a man's failures or question his choices. They responded to consistency, fairness, and competence, qualities Buck had tried to embody, even when they'd proven insufficient in his human relationships. His phone buzzed in his pocket, displaying his daughter Jenny's name. Buck stared at the screen for a long moment before letting it go to voicemail. Jenny called every few weeks, dutiful but distant, their conversations threading carefully around the disappointments and harsh words that had accumulated over the years. She lived in Seattle now, worked for some technology company Buck didn't pretend to understand. She'd offered to help with the ranch's finances, but Buck's pride had built a wall around that particular conversation. "You going to listen to that message?" Pete asked, appearing with a pitchfork and a knowing expression. "Later," Buck said, which they both understood meant never. The workday began with the familiar rhythm of feeding, checking water systems and moving cattle. Buck lost himself in the physical demands, the way muscle memory guided his hands through tasks he'd performed thousands of times. This was what he understood: the weight of hay bales, the temperament of individual animals, the subtle signs that indicated health or illness in his stock. By mid-morning, the storm clouds had built into towering columns that promised afternoon drama. The air carried that electric tension that made both animals and humans restless, a stirring in the atmosphere that whispered of change. Buck watched the Mustang pace the fence line, his usual defiance sharpened into something approaching agitation. "Storms got him worked up," Pete observed, joining Buck at the fence. "Never seen him quite like this." The Mustang was magnificent in his distress, muscles rippling under his dark coat, mane flowing like something out of an old painting of the American West. He represented everything Buck had lost and everything he still cherished about this place. Wildness, freedom, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even when the odds seemed impossible. As they stood watching, a truck turned into the ranch's long driveway, dust plowing behind it in the still air. Buck didn't recognize the vehicle, and unexpected visitors usually meant bad news. Another bill collector, perhaps, or someone from the bank with papers that would make the morning's financial worries seem trivial. The truck pulled up near the house, and Buck was surprised to see a middle-aged Hispanic woman emerge from the driver's side. She moved with purpose, her expression serious but not hostile. From the passenger side came a teenage girl, all long limbs and guarded eyes, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "You expecting company?" Pete asked. "No," Buck replied, his instincts already telling him this visit would change something important, though he couldn't have explained why. The girl stood beside the truck with the same wary alertness Buck recognized in young animals, ready to flee at the first sign of threat, but curious enough to stay and assess the situation. The woman approached with confident steps, extending her hand as she reached the fence. "Mr. Hanley, I'm Rosa Torres. I called yesterday about possible work for my niece." Buck remembered the call vaguely. A woman asking about summer employment, something about a teenage girl who needed structure and purpose. He'd been non-committal, distracted by the stack of bills on his desk. Now, looking at the girl, who stood with such careful stillness, he felt an unexpected stirring of something he couldn't quite name. "This is Maya," Rosa continued. "She's staying with me for the summer, and I thought maybe she could help around the ranch." "She's good with animals." Maya said nothing. But her eyes moved across the ranch with an intensity that surprised Buck. She took in the horses, the condition of the buildings, the Mustang in the far pasture, processing information with the quick assessment of someone who understood what she was seeing. Buck found himself in the uncomfortable position of needing to make a decision without adequate information. The ranch's finances couldn't support additional help, even part-time summer labor. But something about the girl's presence stirred a memory of his own children at that age. The way they'd looked at the world with such hungry curiosity before life taught them to expect disappointment. "We don't really have much work available," he began. But Maya's attention had shifted to the Mustang, and Buck caught something in her expression that made him pause. "That horse," Maya said quietly, speaking for the first time. "How long has he been here?" 3 years, Buck replied. "Found him during a winter storm. He's never taken to being handled." Maya nodded slowly, still watching the Mustang with an intensity that made Buck uncomfortable. It was the look of someone who recognized something familiar, perhaps something wounded. The conversation might have continued, but the Mustang chose that moment to rear up against the fence, his hooves striking the top rail with a crack that echoed across the yard. Maya didn't flinch, didn't step back. She simply watched the display with the same quiet attention, as if she understood something about the horse's frustration that Buck himself had missed. And in that moment, though he couldn't have explained it, Buck knew this girl would change everything. The silver locket lay cool against Maya's chest, hidden beneath her worn t-shirt like a secret she wasn't ready to share with the world. Inside, a tiny photograph showed her mother's face, caught in a moment of pure joy, laughing at something Maya had said during their last good day together. Before the cancer treatments had stolen her strength and the hospital visits had become their entire world. Maya fingered the locket through her shirt as Rosa's truck wound through the streets of Clearwater, Montana, a town so small it barely qualified for the name. 2 weeks ago, Maya had been in Phoenix, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, holding her hand as the machines finally went silent. Now she was here, in a place that felt like the edge of the world. Staying with an aunt she barely knew because the state said 17 was too young to live alone. Even when alone, felt safer than anywhere else. "The Hanley Ranch is just outside town," Rosa said, her voice carefully cheerful in the way adults used when they were trying too hard. Mr. Hanley seemed like a decent man on the phone. Gruff maybe, but decent. Maya nodded without really listening. Rosa meant well, that much was clear. She'd driven 800 miles to Phoenix when the call came, had handled the funeral arrangements with quiet efficiency, had packed Maya's few belongings without asking too many questions about the life she was leaving behind. But meaning well didn't erase the fundamental wrongness of everything. The way the world had tilted off its axis when her mother's breathing stopped. The truck pulled into the ranch's driveway, and Maya's first glimpse of the place stirred something unexpected in her chest. The land stretched wide and golden under the afternoon sun, with mountains rising like guardians in the distance. It looked like the kind of place her mother had described. From her own childhood in New Mexico, open country where a person could breathe deeply and see tomorrow, coming from miles away, but the buildings told a different story. The house needed work, the barn showed its age, and the fence posts leaned at tired angles. Maya had grown up around enough financial struggle to recognize the signs, a place hanging on by determination, and not much else. An older white man emerged from the barn as they parked, his weathered face set in lines that spoke of decades spent squinting into sun and wind. Beside him walked an even older man who moved with the careful grace of someone whose body had absorbed a lifetime of hard work. Both men watched their approach with the cautious assessment rural people reserved for strangers. The introductions were polite but formal. Buck Hanley, she could tell he was the boss by the way the other man deferred to him, had kind eyes despite his gruff manner. But Maya caught the moment when his gaze shifted to her, and she saw the familiar flicker of uncertainty that appeared in adults' faces when they didn't know quite what to do with her. "We don't really have much work available," Buck began, and Maya prepared herself for another polite rejection. She'd heard enough of them in the past 2 weeks. Well-meaning offers of help that evaporated when people realized grief made her quieter than most teenagers, more serious than they expected. But then her attention caught on something that made her forget about jobs and awkward conversations. In the far pasture, a dark horse paced the fence line with the restless energy of barely contained lightning. Even at this distance, Maya could see the power in his movements, the way he held his head high with a pride that refused to be broken. "That horse," she heard herself say. "How long has he been here?" Buck's explanation was brief, but Maya heard the undercurrent of frustration and admiration in his voice. 3 years of trying to gentle the Mustang, multiple trainers who'd given up, a horse that accepted care but refused connection. Maya nodded slowly, understanding something in the animal's isolation that resonated deep in her chest. Her mother had told her stories about the horses they'd owned when Maya was small, before medical bills forced them to sell everything and move to the city. Maya remembered fragments, the warm scent of hay, the gentle strength of horses who'd trusted her small hands, the sense of belonging that came from being understood by something wild and beautiful. The Mustang chose that moment to rear against the fence, his hooves striking wood with a sound like gunfire. Maya didn't flinch. She'd seen enough violence in hospital rooms, enough rage against circumstances beyond anyone's control, to recognize the gesture for what it was. Not aggression, but frustration. The desperate act of something magnificent trapped in a space too small for its spirit. Rosa was explaining Maya's situation, how she'd lost her mother, how she needed structure and purpose for the summer, how she'd always been good with animals. Maya half listened, her attention divided between the conversation and the horse, who continued his restless patrol of the fence line. "Truth is," Buck said finally, "we can't afford extra help right now. Times are tight and hiring someone—" "I don't need much," Maya interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "Just enough for basic expenses. I'm not looking to get rich." Buck studied her for a long moment, and Maya sensed he was weighing something more than just her offer to work cheaply. There was a sadness in his eyes that matched something in her own chest, the hollow ache of someone who'd lost more than he could afford to lose. "You really think you're good with horses?" he asked. "I used to be," Maya replied honestly, "before we had to sell them." Buck's expression shifted slightly, and Maya caught a glimpse of understanding there. He knew what it meant to lose the things you loved for reasons beyond your control. "Tell you what," Buck said, and something in his tone made Rosa look up sharply. "You see that Mustang over there? If you can ride him, I'll hire you for the summer. Full wages, room and board if you want it." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an old Western movie. Maya felt Rosa's sharp intake of breath, saw the concern flash across the older woman's face. Pete, the foreman, shook his head slightly and looked away, but Maya kept her eyes on Buck, recognizing the offer for what it really was, not a genuine opportunity, but a dismissal wrapped in impossible conditions. He was betting she'd back down, make excuses, prove herself to be another city kid who talked big but lacked the courage to match her words with action. "Okay," Maya said simply. The silence that followed was complete, except for the distant sound of the Mustang's hooves against the fence. Buck's face showed genuine surprise, as if he'd fired a blank cartridge and somehow hit a target. "Maya," Rosa began, her voice tight with alarm, "you don't understand." "I understand," Maya said quietly, still looking at Buck. "He's offering me a job if I can ride the horse. That's a fair deal, Buck opened his mouth, probably to explain that he'd been joking, that no reasonable person would attempt such a thing, that the Mustang was dangerous and unpredictable. But something in Maya's steady gaze seemed to stop the words before they formed. "That horse has never been ridden," Pete said finally. "Hasn't even been haltered properly." "It's not safe," Maya nodded, acknowledging the warning without letting it change her decision. Safe had stopped being her primary concern the day she'd watched her mother's face go slack in a hospital bed. Safe was a luxury for people who still believed the world made sense, who trusted that bad things wouldn't happen if you followed the rules and made careful choices. "When?" she asked. Buck looked like a man who'd started an avalanche with a casual kick of snow. "When what?" "When do I try to ride him?" Rosa stepped forward, clearly ready to put an end to the conversation before it went any further. "This is crazy." "Maya, your mother would never—" "My mother's dead," Maya said, the words falling like stones into still water. The harshness of it silenced everyone, but Maya felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of a knot she'd been carrying since the funeral. "She's dead, and I'm here, and I need this job." The truth was simpler and more complicated than any of them could understand. She needed more than just a job. She needed a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose that didn't involve counting the hours until she could escape to somewhere else. The Mustang represented something she couldn't articulate, a chance to prove that some kinds of brokenness could be healed. The trust was still possible even after everything good had been stripped away. Buck looked at the horse, then back at Maya, his expression unreadable. "You could get killed." "Yeah," Maya agreed. "I could." Something passed between them then, an understanding that had nothing to do with horses or jobs or summer arrangements. Buck saw something in her that reminded him of his own stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender would have been the sensible choice. Maya saw something in him that suggested he understood what it meant to make desperate bargains with an indifferent universe. "All right," Buck said finally, his voice rough with what might have been regret or admiration. "But you start with basic ranch work first. Learn your way around. Get to know the other horses. The Mustang isn't going anywhere?" Maya nodded, feeling the silver locket shift against her chest as she moved. Her mother's photograph would remain close to her heart, but for the first time since the funeral, Maya felt something other than grief stirring in her chest. It might have been hope, or it might have been determination, or it might have been the simple recognition that some challenges were worth accepting even when success seemed impossible. The Mustang continued his restless pacing, unaware that his fate had just become tangled with that of a grieving girl who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The worn leather riding gloves sat forgotten in the tack room, pushed to the back of a shelf where Buck wouldn't have to see them every day. Sarah had left them behind along with everything else, the marriage, the children, the dream of building something lasting together on this land. The gloves still held the shape of her hands, supple leather molded by years of gentle contact with reins and horses' necks, a reminder of the woman who'd once believed in the ranch's future as much as Buck had. Maya discovered them on her third morning of work, reaching for a lead rope and finding the gloves instead. She held them up to the light streaming through the dusty window, noting the careful stitching along the seams, the quality that spoke of someone who'd invested in gear meant to last. "Those belonged to Buck's ex-wife," Pete said quietly, appearing behind her with a wheelbarrow full of fresh straw. "She was good with horses." "Real good." Maya set the gloves down carefully, sensing there was a story there that wasn't hers to know. In the past 3 days, she'd learned to read the subtle currents that flowed through the ranch, what subjects were safe to mention, which silences held weight, how Buck's mood could shift when certain memories surfaced without warning. "What happened to her?" Maya asked, then immediately regretted the question when Pete's expression tightened. "Life happened," Pete replied after a moment. "Sometimes two people can love the same thing and still not be able to make it work between them." Maya nodded, understanding more than Pete might have expected. She'd watched her parents navigate their own complicated relationship. Her father, who'd left when the medical bills mounted, who'd sent occasional checks but never visits. who'd called once after the funeral to express his condolences before disappearing back into whatever life he'd built without them. The morning routine had become familiar with surprising speed. Maya arrived at sunrise, fed the horses Buck kept in the barn, checked water systems, and helped Pete with whatever needed doing. The work was physically demanding, but satisfying in a way that surprised her. There was honesty in the simple tasks, mucking stalls, repairing fence, moving hay bales. The horses responded to consistency and competence, not sympathy or complicated emotions. Buck watched her work with the careful attention of someone evaluating a new piece of equipment. He didn't hover or offer unnecessary instruction, but Maya could feel his presence when he thought she wasn't looking. She sensed he was waiting for her to prove herself inadequate to the task, to justify his initial skepticism about hiring her. Instead, Maya found herself remembering skills she'd thought were lost forever. Her hands recalled the proper way to slip a halter over a horse's head, how to read the subtle signs of discomfort or contentment in an animal's posture. The knowledge had been buried under years of city living and medical emergencies, but it surfaced now, like muscle memory awakening from a long sleep. "Your mother teach you to work with horses?" Pete asked one afternoon as they repaired a section of fence together. "My grandmother mostly," Maya replied, driving a post with steady, measured strokes. "Before we moved to Phoenix, my mom grew up on a ranch in New Mexico, but we had to sell everything when I was 8. She didn't elaborate on the reasons. The medical bankruptcy, her father's abandonment, the slow descent into a smaller and smaller world where veterinary bills became an impossible luxury." Pete seemed to understand the shape of the story without needing details. "Horses remember," Pete said simply. "Even when people forget, horses remember who they can trust." Maya glanced toward the far pasture, where the Mustang continued his daily patrol of the fence line. In 3 days, she'd made no direct approach to the horse, but she'd studied him from a distance, learning his patterns and moods. He grazed in the early morning when the ranch was quiet, became restless when storms approached, and always positioned himself where he could see the entire property. "Buck thinks I'm crazy for accepting his challenge," Maya said. Pete considered this while testing the tension on a newly strung wire. "Buck thinks a lot of things. Doesn't mean he's always right, but he's not wrong about the danger." "No," Pete agreed. "That horse has hurt people before. Not out of meanness, out of fear. Sometimes fear makes creatures do things that go against their better nature." Maya understood. Fear had made her move through the last 2 weeks like a sleepwalker, accepting arrangements and decisions without really engaging with them. Fear had made her agree to come to Montana instead of fighting for the right to stay in Phoenix, to remain close to the places where her mother's presence still felt real. But fear had also made her accept Buck's challenge, because the alternative, admitting defeat before even trying, felt like a betrayal of everything her mother had taught her about facing difficult circumstances with courage. "He's been testing me," Maya said, referring to Buck's habit of assigning tasks that seemed designed to reveal her limitations. "Course he has," Pete replied. "Man's been burned before. Makes him careful about who he trusts with things that matter to him." Maya had noticed the signs. The way Buck's jaw tightened when his phone rang, the stack of unopened mail on his kitchen table, the careful way he avoided certain topics in conversation. The ranch was struggling financially, and Buck carried that burden like a stone in his chest. "The Mustang matters to him," Maya observed. "Everything here matters to him," Pete corrected. "This place is all he's got left of the life he thought he was building. That horse is just the wildest part of it, the part that reminds him what he used to believe was possible." As if summoned by their conversation, Buck appeared from the direction of the house, moving with the purposeful stride that meant he had work in mind. Maya had learned to recognize his different walks, the slow morning patrol when he checked systems and planned the day, the quick, efficient movement when problems needed immediate attention, the heavy trudge that appeared when bills arrived or his children didn't return phone calls. "Maya," Buck called when he reached them. "You've been here 3 days. Time you met the rest of the stock properly." He led her to a small paddock where 3 horses stood in the afternoon shade. A grey mare with intelligent eyes, a bay gelding with white markings, and a sorrel with a gentle disposition that reminded Maya of the horses from her childhood. Bell, Chester, and Copper, Buck said, indicating each animal in turn. They're good horses, well-trained, patient with beginners. If you're serious about this Mustang business, you'd better prove you can handle these 3 first. Maya approached Bell first, extending her hand for the mare to investigate. The horse sniffed her palm, then allowed Maya to stroke her neck with the casual acceptance that came from years of positive human contact. "She likes you," Buck observed, and Maya caught something in his tone that might have been approval. "Horses are honest," Maya replied, running her fingers through Bell's mane. "They don't pretend to feel things they don't feel." Buck was quiet for a moment, watching Maya work with the mare. "Your aunt says you lost your mother recently." Maya's hand stilled on Bell's neck. "Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss." The words were simple, but Maya heard genuine sympathy in them. Buck understood something about loss, about the way grief could hollow out a person's chest and make everything else feel insignificant by comparison. "Thank you," Maya said quietly. They worked in comfortable silence after that, Maya familiarizing herself with each horse's personality, while Buck observed from the fence rail. The afternoon sun slanted across the paddock, casting long shadows that reminded Maya of similar moments. From her childhood, the peaceful satisfaction of being understood by animals who asked for nothing more than competent care and consistent kindness. When the work was finished and the horses returned to their pasture, Buck walked with Maya toward the house where Rosa waited to drive her back to town. "You did good work today," Buck said as they reached the truck. "Thank you. That doesn't change anything about the Mustang," he added. "That's still a dangerous proposition." Maya met his eyes steadily. "I know," Buck nodded slowly, as if something in her response had satisfied him. "We'll see then. We'll see what you're really made of." As Rosa's truck pulled away from the ranch, Maya touched the silver locket beneath her shirt and allowed herself to imagine what her mother would think of this place. These people, this impossible challenge she'd accepted. The answer came without hesitation. Her mother would have been proud, not of the recklessness, but of the refusal to let fear make her smaller than she was meant to be. The faded photograph lay pressed between the pages of Buck's father's old Bible, a relic he'd kept more from habit than faith. In the picture, a younger Buck smiled broadly while hoisting his 6-year-old daughter Jenny on his shoulders, his son Michael grinning beside them as they stood in front of the ranch house during better times. Sarah had taken the photo during their 5th wedding anniversary celebration, back when the future stretched ahead of them like an open road and anything seemed possible. Buck discovered Maya looking at the photograph one morning, when she'd accidentally knocked the Bible from the kitchen table while reaching for the coffee pot he'd offered her. The book had fallen open to that exact page, as if the universe had decided it was time for old wounds to see daylight again. "Your children?" Maya asked, her voice carefully neutral as she helped gather the scattered items. "Were," Buck replied, then immediately regretted the harshness of the word. "Ah, they're adults now, living their own lives." Maya studied the photograph with the intense attention she brought to everything important. "They look happy here." "We all were back then." Buck took the Bible from her hands and closed it without looking at the picture again. "Things change." But the image lingered in his mind as they walked to the barn together, Maya matching his pace with the easy stride she'd developed over the past week. She'd proven herself capable beyond his initial expectations, competent with the horses, reliable with routine tasks, and possessed of an intuitive understanding of ranch rhythms that suggested genuine experience rather than city kid pretense. "Tell me about the Mustang," Maya said, as they reached the paddock where Bell, Chester, and Copper waited for their morning routine. "How did you really find him?" Buck leaned against the fence rail, considering how much of the story was worth sharing. "January 3 years ago. Worst storm in 20 years, snow drifting 8 feet in places. I was checking the far pasture when I saw this dark shape against the fence line. Thought it was a dead tree at first. Maya worked while he talked, her hands sure and gentle as she haltered Belle and led the mare toward the barn. Buck found himself appreciating the way she listened, not just waiting for her turn to speak, but actually absorbing what he told her. He was more dead than alive when I got close enough to see what he was, Buck continued, ribs showing, ice in his mane, barely able to stand. Took me 2 hours to get him loaded in the trailer, and that was only because he was too weak to fight much. But he recovered. Physically, yes. Took months of careful feeding to get weight back on him, veterinary care for frostbite damage to his ears. But something in him stayed wild, stayed angry. Like he blamed me for saving him when he was ready to die. Maya emerged from the barn, leading Belle, who followed with the patient cooperation of a horse who'd learned to trust human judgment. Maybe he wasn't angry, Maya suggested. Maybe he was afraid you'd leave him like everyone else had. The observation struck Buck as uncomfortably perceptive. He watched Maya return Belle to the pasture and collect Chester, noting the efficient way she moved. The calm confidence that seemed to settle the horses before she even touched them. "You think you understand him," Buck said. "I think I understand what it feels like to have people make decisions about your life without asking what you want." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a statement of fact that carried more weight than any complaint. Buck thought about his own children, how many decisions he'd made over the years based on what he thought was best for them, rather than what they might have chosen for themselves. Rosa arrived at mid-morning, bringing fresh-baked bread and the kind of warm energy that seemed to brighten whatever space she occupied. Buck watched from the barn as Maya greeted her aunt with genuine affection. The first time he'd seen the girl's careful composure crack enough to reveal the teenager underneath. "She's been working hard," Rosa observed when Buck joined them near the truck. "Sleeping better than she has since. Well, since everything happened. She's a good worker," Buck acknowledged. "Knows more about horses than she initially let on," Rosa smiled. "Maya's always been modest about her abilities. Her mother taught her that competence speaks louder than boasting." Buck found himself curious about Maya's mother, this woman who'd raised a daughter capable of such quiet strength. "What was she like? Carmen?" "She was—" Rosa paused, searching for words. "She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel capable of more than they thought possible. Even when she was sick, especially when she was sick. She focused on building Maya up rather than leaning on her." Buck thought about his own children, how his pride and stubbornness had driven wedges between them during the years when his marriage was failing and the ranch was struggling. He'd been so focused on preserving his independence that he'd forgotten the value of showing vulnerability, of letting the people you loved know that you needed them. Maya mentioned that her family used to have horses, Buck said, a small ranch outside Albuquerque. Carmen's father was a horse trainer, taught Maya everything she knows about reading animals, understanding their moods and needs. They had to sell when the medical bills started mounting. Buck understood the economics of that particular nightmare. Medical bankruptcy could destroy a family's accumulated wealth in months, reduce lifelong dreams to liquidation sales and desperate choices. He'd been fortunate that Sarah's illness had been covered by insurance, but he'd watched other ranch families lose everything to circumstances beyond their control. How much does Maya know about her father? Buck asked, then immediately wondered why he cared. Rosa's expression tightened. "Enough to know he's not someone she can count on. He sends money occasionally, calls on birthdays when he remembers." Carmen protected Maya from the worst of it, but a girl knows when her father chooses his own comfort over her welfare. Buck felt an unexpected surge of anger toward a man he'd never met, someone who'd abandoned a daughter who deserved better. The emotion surprised him with its intensity, suggesting that Maya had already claimed more of his attention than he'd realized. They were interrupted by a commotion from the far pasture, the Mustang expressing his opinion about something, with a series of challenging whinnies. Buck and Rosa turned to see Maya standing at the fence, not close enough to threaten the horse, but positioned where he could see her clearly. "What's she doing?" Rosa asked, worry creeping into her voice. "Learning," Buck replied. Though he wasn't entirely sure what lesson Maya was trying to absorb, the Mustang paced parallel to the fence, his attention fixed on Maya with an intensity that made Buck nervous. The horse was magnificent in his agitation, muscles rippling under his dark coat, mane flowing like something from a painting of the Old West. But he was also unpredictable, capable of explosive violence when he felt cornered or threatened. Maya stood perfectly still, making no move to approach but not retreating either. Buck could see her studying the horse's movements, cataloging information about his patterns and responses. It was the same focused attention she brought to all her work, but applied to something infinitely more dangerous. "She's really going to try it, isn't she?" Rosa said quietly. "Yeah," Buck replied. "I think she is. Should I be worried?" Buck considered the question seriously. Maya had demonstrated competence with the other horses, shown good judgment in most situations, proven herself capable of careful observation and patient planning. But the Mustang represented a different category of challenge entirely. "Yes," Buck said finally, "but not for the reasons you might think." Rosa looked at him questioningly, but Buck couldn't explain what he meant without revealing his own growing investment in Maya's success. Somewhere over the past week, her quiet determination had begun to matter to him in ways that went beyond simple employment. She reminded him of things he'd forgotten about: courage and persistence, about the value of accepting difficult challenges even when success wasn't guaranteed. When Maya returned from the fence, her expression was thoughtful but not discouraged. Buck had expected her to show signs of intimidation after observing the Mustang's power up close, but instead she seemed energized by what she'd learned. "He's not as angry as he seems," Maya said. "He's testing me, trying to figure out if I'm like the others who gave up on him." "And what did you conclude?" Buck asked. Maya smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. "That he's worth the risk." As Rosa prepared to leave, she pulled Buck aside with the casual authority of someone accustomed to speaking her mind. "That girl has been through more loss than most adults could handle. Don't let your challenge become another disappointment in her life." Buck nodded, understanding the warning. Maya had already proven herself worthy of respect, regardless of what happened with the Mustang. The question was whether he could set aside his own need to be right long enough to help her, succeed at something that mattered to both of them, more than either was willing to admit. The broken fence post lay where it had fallen during the previous night's storm. Its weathered wood split down the middle, like a physical manifestation of all the things that needed mending on the ranch. Buck stared at the damage with the weary resignation of a man who'd grown accustomed to fixing problems with inadequate resources and insufficient time. "That's the third post this month," Pete observed, joining Buck at the fence line where the Mustang's pasture met the main grazing area. "This whole section needs replacing before winter." Buck knew Pete was right, just as he knew they couldn't afford the materials for a proper repair job. The stack of bills on his kitchen table had grown thicker over the past 2 weeks, each envelope containing another reminder that the ranch's financial situation had moved beyond difficult into genuinely precarious territory. "We'll patch it for now," Buck said, though they both understood that patching had become their standard response to problems that deserved better solutions. Maya appeared from the direction of the barn, carrying a coil of rope and moving with the purposeful stride that had become familiar over the past 10 days. Buck had watched her routine evolve as she learned the ranch's rhythms: early morning care for the domestic horses, midday repairs and maintenance, late afternoon observation of the Mustang from increasingly close distances. "Morning," Maya said, setting down her rope and examining the broken post with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. "Storm damage?" "Wind and old wood don't mix well," Buck replied. "This fence has been here since my father's time. Nothing lasts forever." Maya ran her hand along the split wood, testing its structural integrity with surprising expertise. "My grandfather always said fences were like relationships. They needed constant attention, or they'd fall apart when you needed them most." Buck found himself curious about Maya's grandfather, this man who'd apparently filled some of the space left by an absent father. Over the past week, Maya had revealed fragments of her family history in casual comments and passing observations, creating a picture of people who'd faced hardship with dignity and practical wisdom. "Your grandfather was a horseman too?" Buck asked, among other things. He said horses taught him everything he needed to know about people. The trust had to be earned one small gesture at a time. That consistency mattered more than grand gestures, and that some creatures needed more time and patience than others, as if summoned by their conversation. The Mustang approached the fence line with his characteristic blend of curiosity and caution. Over the past week, he'd grown accustomed to Maya's presence, no longer retreating to the far corner of the pasture when she appeared. Progress, Buck supposed, though he wasn't sure progress toward what. "He's beautiful," Maya said quietly, watching the horse with the focused attention that had become her trademark. "Even with all that wariness, you can see the intelligence in his eyes." Buck studied the Mustang with fresh perspective, trying to see what Maya saw beyond the defensive posturing and unpredictable temperament. The horse was indeed magnificent. Powerful shoulders, elegant neck, coat that gleamed like polished obsidian in the morning sun. But beauty and intelligence didn't necessarily translate into rideable, and Buck's challenge had been about riding, not admiration. "Beauty can be dangerous," Buck said. "Sometimes the most attractive things are the ones that'll hurt you worst." Maya glanced at him with an expression that suggested she understood he wasn't talking only about horses. "My mother used to say that the most beautiful things in life were always the ones worth taking risks for. Your mother was a wise woman. She was also a romantic. Sometimes those two things worked together. Sometimes they didn't." Buck heard something in Maya's tone that spoke of complicated family dynamics, the kind of love that existed alongside disappointment and unfulfilled dreams. His own marriage had carried similar tensions, deep affection, undermined by incompatible visions of what their life together should look like. "Tell me about her," Buck said, surprising himself with the request. Maya was quiet for a moment, her attention apparently focused on the Mustang, but her thoughts clearly elsewhere. She was stubborn. That's probably the first thing you'd notice about her. When she decided something was worth fighting for, she wouldn't give up. "Sounds familiar," Maya smiled at that. "She got sick when I was 15. Ovarian cancer stage 3 by the time they caught it. The doctors gave her 2 years, maybe 3 with aggressive treatment." Buck waited, understanding that Maya was sharing something important and trusting him to receive it without platitudes or false comfort. "She made it 4 years," Maya continued. 4 years of surgeries and chemotherapy and clinical trials. She fought that disease like it was a personal enemy, like giving up would be letting down everyone who'd ever believed in her, including you, especially me. Even when the treatments made her so sick she could barely stand, she'd get up every morning and make breakfast, help me with homework, pretend everything was normal. She said giving in to despair was a luxury we couldn't afford. Buck thought about his own children, how his pride had prevented him from showing vulnerability during the worst periods of his marriage and the ranch's decline. He'd thought he was protecting them from adult worries, but maybe he'd only been protecting himself from their judgment. "She sounds like someone who would have understood this place," Buck said, gesturing toward the ranch with its combination of beauty and struggle. "She would have loved it," Maya agreed. "She used to talk about getting back to the land someday, having horses again, building something that would last. The ranch we had when I was little. That was her dream as much as my grandfather's. What happened to it?" Maya's expression tightened slightly. "My father happened to it. When the medical bills started mounting, he decided his dreams were more important than hers. Sold everything while she was in the hospital for her first surgery. Moved the money to accounts she couldn't access." Buck felt a familiar surge of anger toward Maya's father. This man whose selfishness had stolen so much from the people who deserved better. "Where is he now?" "Las Vegas, last I heard. Remarried, new family, fresh start. He sends guilt money occasionally, but he's never asked to see me since the funeral." The casual way Maya delivered this information suggested she'd made peace with her father's abandonment at least on the surface. But Buck recognized the careful control that kept pain from showing, the same mechanism he'd used to navigate his own losses without falling apart. His loss, Buck said simply. Maya looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such direct support from someone who barely knew her. "Thank you." They worked in comfortable silence after that, repairing the broken fence post with materials salvaged from other projects and creative problem-solving that had become second nature on the ranch. Maya proved surprisingly handy with tools, her small hands able to reach spaces that challenged Buck's larger frame. "Rosa mentioned you're having some financial difficulties," Maya said as they tested the stability of their repair. Buck's first instinct was to deflect, to maintain the fiction that everything was under control. But something about Maya's straightforward manner made pretense seem unnecessary. "The ranch is struggling, has been for a while. Is that why you don't want to hire help? Even when you could use it?" "Partly," Buck considered how much truth to share. "Also partly because I'm not good at depending on other people. Sarah used to say my independence was my best quality and my worst flaw. What do you think?" Buck studied Maya's face, noting the genuine interest there, the absence of judgment or pity. "I think she was probably right. I've spent so much time proving I could handle things alone that I forgot how to accept help when I needed it. Is that what happened with your children?" The question was direct enough to sting, but Buck found himself appreciating Maya's willingness to ask difficult questions rather than dancing around uncomfortable topics. "Among other things, when the ranch started struggling, when my marriage fell apart, I thought I was protecting them by not involving them in adult problems. Instead, I just pushed them away." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "My mother did the opposite. She involved me in everything: medical decisions, financial planning, end-of-life arrangements. Sometimes I wished she'd protected me more, but I'm glad she trusted me with the truth." Buck considered this as they gathered their tools and prepared to move on to other tasks. Maybe his mistake hadn't been having problems, but refusing to trust his children with the reality of those problems. Maybe independence was only valuable when it didn't cost you the relationships that mattered most. As they walked back toward the barn, Buck noticed Maya's attention drawn once again to the Mustang, who watched their departure with something that might have been interest rather than mere wariness. "Tomorrow," Maya said quietly, "I'm going to try getting closer to him." Buck felt a familiar surge of anxiety, mixed with something that might have been anticipation. "How much closer?" "Close enough to see if he'll let me touch him." "Maya, I know the risks," she interrupted gently, "but I also know that some things are worth the chance of getting hurt." Buck understood she was talking about more than just the horse, and found himself hoping she was right. The handwritten letter sat in Buck's desk drawer like an accusation, its envelope yellowed with age, and bearing a return address he'd memorized, despite never opening it. Michael's careful script spelled out "Dad" on the front, the single word carrying more weight than any formal greeting. The letter had arrived 3 years ago, just after Sarah's death, and Buck had been too proud or too afraid to discover what forgiveness might sound. Like in his son's voice, Maya made a breakthrough with the Mustang on a Tuesday morning, when the air carried the promise of rain and the horses seemed unusually restless. Buck watched from the barn as she approached the fence, with the slow, deliberate movements that had become her signature approach to the wary horse. What happened next surprised them both. The Mustang didn't retreat. Instead, he moved closer to the fence, his dark eyes fixed on Maya with an intensity that spoke of decision rather than mere curiosity. When Maya extended her hand through the rails, the horse stretched his neck forward and allowed her fingertips to brush his muzzle, the first voluntary contact he'd made with any human since arriving at the ranch. Buck felt his breath catch in his chest, a mixture of admiration and concern that surprised him with its intensity. Maya had achieved in 2 weeks what professional trainers had failed to accomplish in months. The moment lasted only seconds before the Mustang stepped back, but something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between girl and horse. "Did you see that?" Maya called, her voice carrying excitement that made her sound younger than her 17 years. I saw it, Buck replied, walking over to join her at the fence. Doesn't mean he's ready to be ridden. No, but it means he's ready to trust. That's the first step to everything else. Buck studied Maya's face, noting the flush of accomplishment and the determined set of her jaw. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd watched her transform from a grieving teenager into someone more purposeful, more centered. The work seemed to suit her, but more than that, the challenge seemed to be awakening something in her that had been dormant since her mother's death. You know, Buck said carefully, winning our bet doesn't have to be about proving anything to me. You've already earned your place here. Maya looked at him with surprise. You're offering to call it off? I'm saying you don't have to risk getting hurt just to show you belong somewhere. Maya considered this for a long moment. Her attention divided between Buck and the Mustang, who continued to watch them from a respectful distance. What if it's not about proving I belong? What if it's about proving that broken things can still be fixed? The question hit closer to home than Buck was comfortable acknowledging. He'd spent the past 3 years telling himself that some relationships were too damaged to repair, that some mistakes left permanent scars. But watching Maya work with the Mustang suggested that patience and understanding could accomplish things that force and stubbornness could not. Rosa arrived for her weekly visit just as Maya finished her morning routine with the domestic horses. Buck had grown to appreciate these visits, partly because Rosa brought news from town and fresh-baked goods, but mostly because her presence seemed to settle something restless in Maya's spirit. She's looking better, Rosa observed, watching Maya lead Copper back to the pasture with the confident ease of someone who'd found her natural element. More like the girl she was before everything fell apart. She's good with the animals, Buck agreed. Natural instincts, good judgment. Her grandfather taught her well, Rosa smiled knowingly. Her grandfather taught her about horses. You're teaching her about something else entirely. Buck felt heat rise in his cheeks, uncomfortable with Rosa's implication that he was providing anything beyond employment. I'm just giving her work to do. You're giving her a reason to get up in the morning, a place where her skills matter, people who see her value. That's not just work, that's healing. Buck wanted to protest that he wasn't qualified to heal anyone, that his own broken relationships disqualified him from helping someone else find wholeness. But something in Rosa's expression suggested she understood his limitations and valued his efforts anyway. She's been good for this place too, Pete said, appearing with his usual quiet timing. Horses are calmer when she's around. Even that Mustang seems less agitated lately. Buck had noticed the same thing, a subtle shift in the ranch's atmosphere since Maya's arrival. The domestic horses sought her attention, following her movements with the kind of interest they usually reserved for feeding time. Even the cats that lived in the barn had begun appearing when Maya worked, as if drawn by some quality Buck couldn't identify, but recognized as valuable. There's something else, Pete continued, his tone suggesting he'd been debating whether to share whatever was on his mind. Had a call yesterday from Jim Harrison over in Billings. He's heard about what Maya's doing with the Mustang, wants to know if we'd be interested in taking on some problem horses. Buck looked up sharply. Horse training brought better money than cattle, but it also required facilities and expertise they didn't currently possess. What kind of problems? Rescue horses mostly. Animals that have been abused or neglected need patient rehabilitation before they can be adopted. Jim's got connections with several rescue organizations. Buck felt a stirring of possibility mixed with familiar caution. Additional income could help stabilize the ranch's finances, but taking on damaged horses would also mean accepting responsibility for creatures that might never fully recover. What did you tell him? Told him I'd discuss it with you. But Buck, if Maya can work miracles with that Mustang, imagine what she could do with horses that actually want to be helped. The conversation was interrupted by Maya's approach, her expression thoughtful in the way that meant she'd been processing something important while working. I've been thinking about what my mother would say about all this, Maya said without preamble. About the challenge, the ranch, taking risks for things that matter. Buck waited, sensing that Maya was working towards something significant. She always said that healing required two things: time and the willingness to be vulnerable. The time lets wounds close properly, but the vulnerability is what allows connection to happen again. Wise woman, Rosa murmured. She was. And I think she'd tell me that riding the Mustang isn't really about proving I can do something dangerous. It's about proving that trust is still possible, even after everything that's been broken. Buck felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the careful control he'd maintained around his own capacity for connection. Maya's determination to reach the Mustang reflected his own buried desire to repair the relationships he'd damaged through pride and stubbornness. "Maya," Buck said slowly, "there's something I want to show you." He led her to the house, to his desk where the unopened letter waited in its drawer. His hands shook slightly as he retrieved the envelope, 3 years of avoidance making the simple action feel momentous. "From my son," Buck explained. "I've been too proud to open it." Maya studied the envelope with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. "What are you afraid it says?" Buck considered the question seriously. "That he's given up on me. That I waited too long to try making things right. What if it says the opposite?" Buck looked at Maya, this girl who'd lost so much but refused to stop believing in the possibility of healing. Her courage in approaching the Mustang reflected the same faith that allowed her to imagine forgiveness might be waiting in an unopened letter. "I don't know if I'm ready to find out." Buck admitted. "Readiness is overrated," Maya said gently. "Sometimes you just have to trust that the thing you're afraid of isn't as bad as the fear itself." Buck held the letter for a long moment, feeling the weight of 3 years' worth of regret and hope. Maya was right. Healing required vulnerability, the willingness to discover that connection might still be possible even after everything that had been broken. "Will you stay while I read it?" Buck asked. Maya nodded, settling into the chair across from his desk with the patient attention she showed to everything that mattered. Buck opened the envelope with careful fingers, unfolding pages that would either confirm his worst fears or offer the possibility of a different kind of future entirely. The legal document arrived on a Thursday morning. With the mundane efficiency of institutional cruelty, its certified mail status demanding Buck's signature for what he already knew would be catastrophic news. The foreclosure notice lay spread across his kitchen table like a death certificate, its formal language converting 3 generations of family history into a timeline of debt resolution and property seizure. But the morning had started with triumph. Maya had successfully mounted the Mustang for the first time, a moment Buck would have celebrated under different circumstances. The breakthrough had come after 3 weeks of patient groundwork, countless hours of building trust through consistent presence and gentle persistence. The Mustang, whom Maya had privately named Thunder for his habit of rolling across the pasture like storm clouds, had finally allowed her onto his back for a brief, trembling moment that felt like witnessing something sacred. Buck had watched from the fence rail as Maya approached Thunder with the halter she'd been working with for days. The horse had accepted the makeshift tack with the resignation of someone surrendering to the inevitable, his dark eyes reflecting intelligence and something that might have been curiosity. When Maya had swung her leg over his back, Thunder had stood perfectly still for perhaps 30 seconds before his nerve broke, and Buck jumped her off in a display of equine dignity that sent her rolling in the dirt, but laughing rather than crying. "He let me on." Maya had called from the ground, brushing dust from her jeans with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. For real riding, not just touching or leading. "He let me sit on his back." Buck had felt pride swell in his chest, a complex emotion that encompassed Maya's courage, Thunder's trust, and his own role in creating the conditions where such a moment could happen. For the first time since making his sarcastic challenge, Buck had begun to believe Maya might actually succeed in riding the Mustang properly. Then the mail had arrived, and celebration had transformed into crisis management. The foreclosure papers were comprehensive and merciless. 60 days to bring the mortgage current or face legal action. 120 days to complete the sale of the property or face sheriff's auction. Language that reduced a lifetime of work to a series of deadlines and financial penalties. Pete found Buck staring at the documents when he came looking for instructions about the afternoon's work schedule. The older man took one look at Buck's expression and closed the kitchen door behind him. "How bad?" Pete asked. "Bad." Buck pushed the papers across the table so Pete could see for himself. 60 days to come up with $43,000, or they start the legal process. Pete whistled low, a sound that conveyed everything Buck was feeling without requiring additional words. $43,000 might as well have been $43 million, given the ranch's current financial situation. "There's more," Buck said, retrieving a folder from his desk drawer. "Medical bills from Sarah's final year. I've been paying them off slowly, but the treatment center is demanding full payment." Pete's expression shifted as he processed this information. Buck had never spoken directly about the financial arrangements surrounding his ex-wife's illness. But Pete was intelligent enough to fill in the gaps. "You've been paying Sarah's medical bills," Pete said. "Even after the divorce. Insurance covered most of it, but there were experimental treatments, specialists who didn't take coverage. She was dying, Pete. What was I supposed to do? Let her die faster because we couldn't afford to help her?" Pete leaned back in his chair, understanding dawning in his weathered features. "That's where the ranch money went. Not bad investments or poor management. You've been supporting 2 households and paying for cancer treatment." Buck nodded, feeling exposed in a way that made him want to retreat to the barn where problems had clearer solutions. He'd never intended for anyone to know about the financial support he'd provided Sarah during her final years, but the foreclosure had made privacy a luxury he could no longer afford. "The kids know?" Pete asked. "No. Sarah didn't want them to worry about money when they should have been focused on spending time with her. I thought we'd have more time to figure things out." Maya appeared in the doorway, her face still flushed with excitement from her success with Thunder. But her expression shifted as she took in the scene. Buck's obvious distress, Pete's concerned presence, the legal papers spread across the table like evidence of failure. "Is everything okay?" Maya asked. Buck's first instinct was to deflect, to maintain the fiction that adult problems didn't concern teenagers. But something about Maya's steady gaze reminded him of their conversation about trust and vulnerability, about the courage required to accept help when you needed it. "The ranch is being foreclosed," Buck said simply. "We have 60 days to come up with money we don't have, or lose everything." Maya moved into the room with the careful attention she brought to approaching skittish horses, as if she understood that Buck's composure was more fragile than it appeared. She picked up the foreclosure notice and read it with the focused concentration that had become her trademark. "This is because of your ex-wife's medical bills," Maya said. It wasn't a question. Buck looked at her sharply. "Now, how did you—" "Rosa mentioned that Sarah had been sick before she died. And you have that careful way of not talking about money that people develop when they're paying for things they can't afford, but can't not pay for." Pete chuckled despite the circumstances. "Kids got you figured out, Buck. Why didn't you tell your children?" Maya asked. "About helping pay for their mother's treatment." Buck considered how to explain pride to someone who'd never had the luxury of choosing dignity over practicality. "Because I didn't want them to feel guilty about their mother getting the care she needed. Because I didn't want them to think they owed me anything for doing what any decent man would do." Maya studied his face with the same intensity she'd used to understand Thunder's moods and motivations. "And because you didn't want them to see you as someone who needed help." The observation was accurate enough to sting. Buck had spent years cultivating an image of competence and self-sufficiency, partly to protect his family from worry and partly to protect himself from the vulnerability that came with admitting you couldn't handle everything alone. "Something like that," Buck acknowledged. Maya set down the foreclosure notice and looked around the kitchen with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating options. "What would it take to save the ranch?" More than we have, Buck replied. The mortgage payment brings us current, but there are other debts, ongoing expenses. We'd need at least 60,000 to get clear, maybe more. What about selling some of the land? Thought about it. But the land closest to town is leased for grazing, and breaking that lease would cost almost as much as we'd make on the sale. The back section isn't worth much without water access. Maya was quiet for a moment, processing information with the methodical approach she brought to complex problems. Buck found himself watching her face, curious about what solutions might occur to someone who hadn't spent years accepting limitations as permanent conditions. What about the horses? Maya asked. Pete mentioned that rescue work could bring income. If we could prove that Thunder can be rehabilitated, that might open doors with organizations that pay for training services. Buck felt a stirring of possibility, followed immediately by the familiar caution that had guided his decision-making for years. That's a long-term solution to a short-term problem. Maybe, or maybe it's the beginning of a different kind of ranch entirely. Pete leaned forward, interest sharpening his expression. What are you thinking, Maya? I'm thinking about my mother, Maya said. How she fought her cancer by changing everything about how she approached treatment. Instead of just accepting what the doctors told her, she researched alternatives, found specialists, created partnerships with other patients who were fighting the same battle. Buck understood the parallel Maya was drawing, but he wasn't sure it applied to their situation. Fighting cancer isn't the same as fighting for closure. No, but fighting hopelessness is. My mother taught me that when the conventional approach isn't working, you don't give up, you get creative. Maya moved to the window that looked out over the pastures where Thunder grazed with the other horses, his dark coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. What if we turned your challenge into something bigger? What if we documented the process of rehabilitating Thunder, used it to attract attention from people who believe in second chances? Buck felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the despair that had settled there since opening the foreclosure notice. Maya's suggestion was ambitious to the point of fantasy, but it was also the first idea anyone had offered that didn't require accepting defeat as a starting point. You're talking about publicity, Buck said slowly. Media attention. I'm talking about showing people what's possible when someone refuses to give up on something worth saving. Pete nodded thoughtfully. Could work. Local newspaper might be interested, maybe the Agricultural Extension Service. People love stories about underdogs. Buck looked at Maya, this girl who'd arrived at his ranch carrying her own burden of loss and had somehow transformed a moment of cruel jest into a possibility for salvation. Her success with Thunder represented more than just horse training. It proved that patience and understanding could accomplish things that force and resignation could not. It's a risk, Buck said. Everything worthwhile is, Maya replied. But what's the alternative? Buck thought about his son's letter, still unopened on his desk, and his daughter's unanswered phone calls. He thought about Pete's loyalty and Rose's friendship, about the land his grandfather had chosen, and the dreams 3 generations of Hanley men had tried to build here. He thought about Maya's courage in approaching Thunder, and her faith that broken things could still be healed. All right, Buck said finally. Let's see if we can save this place. The silver horsebrush had belonged to Buck's grandmother, a woman who gentled horses with patience and intuition, back when such qualities were considered as valuable as strength and determination. Buck found it while searching through tackroom storage for anything that might help with Maya's final preparations, its ornate handle catching the afternoon light like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. He'd forgotten he still owned it, this relic from a time when the ranch had supported 3 generations and horse training had been as much art as occupation. This was my grandmother's, Buck said, offering the brush to Maya as she prepared Thunder for what they'd all begun thinking of as the demonstration. She said horses could tell the difference between someone who was trying to control them and someone who was trying to understand them. Maya accepted the brush with the reverence it deserved, running her fingers over the worn silver handle and the soft bristles that still held the memory of countless horses' coats. She sounds like someone who knew what she was doing, She was the best horse trainer in 3 counties, Buck replied. Taught my father everything he knew, which he passed on to me. Though I suspect you've got more of her intuition than I ever did. The week since they'd decided to fight the foreclosure had passed in a blur of activity that felt equal parts desperate and hopeful. Maya's suggestion to document Thunder's rehabilitation had evolved into something more comprehensive, a public demonstration that would showcase not just her success with the Mustang, but the ranch's potential as a rehabilitation center for damaged horses. Rosa had proved invaluable in organizing community support, her connections in town yielding a surprising network of people willing to help spread word about the event. The local newspaper had run a feature story about Maya's work with Thunder, complete with photographs that captured both the girl's quiet determination and the horse's magnificent spirit. Agricultural Extension Services had expressed interest, and 2 rescue organizations had already inquired about potential partnerships. But success depended on Maya's ability to fully ride Thunder in front of an audience. And that remained an open question, despite the progress she'd made. The Mustang had accepted her presence on his back for increasingly longer periods, but sustained riding required a level of trust that might not withstand the pressure of public attention. How are you feeling about tomorrow? Buck asked, as Maya worked the brush through Thunder's mane with practiced strokes that seemed to calm both girl and horse. Nervous, Maya admitted, but the good kind of nervous, like before a performance when you know you've prepared as much as possible. Buck understood that distinction. The past week had revealed depths to Maya's preparation that went beyond simple horse training. She'd studied Thunder's responses to different weather conditions, learned to read his moods with the precision of someone whose survival depended on accurate interpretation. More importantly, she'd somehow convinced the Mustang that her success was connected to his own well-being. There's something else, Buck said, feeling heat rise in his cheeks as he prepared to share information he'd kept private for weeks. I called my son last night. Maya's hand stilled on Thunder's neck, but her expression remained carefully neutral. Buck had learned to appreciate her way of receiving important information without immediately offering judgment or advice. I read his letter first, Buck continued. The one I'd been avoiding. Turns out he wasn't writing to tell me he was giving up on our relationship. He was writing to tell me he understood why I'd made the choices I did, and that he wanted to find a way forward. What did he say when you called? Buck smiled despite the emotional complexity of the conversation. That it was about time. That he'd been waiting 3 years for me to stop being too proud to pick up the phone. Is he coming tomorrow? He's driving down from Missoula tonight, bringing his wife and my granddaughter. Buck paused, still amazed by the reality of that statement. I haven't seen Emma since she was 5 years old. She's 8 now. Maya resumed brushing Thunder, but Buck caught the slight smile that curved her lips. Your grandmother's brush is going to help save the ranch and bring your family back together. She must have been something special. She was. And I think she would have liked you. The words carried more weight than Buck had intended, but Maya received them with the same grace she brought to everything else that mattered. Over the past month, she'd become essential to the ranch's operation in ways that went beyond simple labor. Her presence had changed the rhythm of the place, brought a quality of hope that Buck hadn't realized was missing until it returned. Pete appeared from the direction of the house, moving with the quick step that meant he had news to share. Just got off the phone with Jim Harrison. He's bringing 3 potential investors tomorrow, people who are interested in the rescue horse operation. Buck felt familiar anxiety compete with possibility. External investors meant external oversight, potential loss of control over decisions that affected his family's legacy. But they also meant resources that could ensure the ranch's survival beyond the immediate crisis. What kind of investors? Maya asked. Good kind, according to Jim. People who've made money in other businesses and want to support agricultural projects that serve community needs. They're not looking to take over, just to help viable operations expand. Buck nodded slowly, understanding that tomorrow's demonstration would determine more than just whether Maya could ride Thunder. It would establish whether their vision of the ranch's future was compelling enough to attract the support they needed to survive. "No pressure," Maya said dryly, and Buck found himself laughing despite everything. "Just a little," he agreed. They spent the remainder of the afternoon in final preparations that felt equal parts practical and ritualistic. Maya worked with Thunder through a series of exercises designed to prepare him for the stress of audience attention, mounting and dismounting from both sides, responding to subtle pressure from her legs and hands, maintaining calm in the presence of unfamiliar sounds and movements. Buck watched from various positions around the paddock, noting the growing partnership between girl and horse. What had started as Maya's challenge to prove herself had evolved into something more collaborative, a dance between two beings who'd learned to trust each other's intentions, even when outcomes remained uncertain. "He's ready," Maya announced as she dismounted for the final time, her voice carrying conviction that eased some of Buck's worry. "And you?" Maya considered the question seriously, her attention divided between Thunder and the larger implications of what they were attempting. "I'm ready to try. Whether I succeed or not depends on things I can't control, but I've done everything I know how to do." Buck found wisdom in that distinction. His own failures over the years had often stemmed from trying to control outcomes rather than focusing on preparation and execution. The foreclosure, his marriage's collapse, his estrangement from his children, all had involved his inability to accept that some things required faith in addition to effort. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Buck why his grandfather had chosen this place, he found himself thinking about legacy in ways that went beyond financial survival. The ranch represented more than just property. It embodied the accumulated dreams and struggles of people who'd believed that working the land with respect and dedication could create something lasting. Maya's arrival had reminded him that legacy wasn't just about preserving what previous generations had built, but about adapting their values to meet current challenges. Her willingness to risk everything on the belief that broken things could be healed had shown him possibilities he'd stopped believing were available. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Buck said, as they secured the tack room and prepared to end the day, "I want you to know that having you here has made this place better than it was." Maya looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such direct acknowledgement of her impact. "Thank you. Being here has made me better than I was too. Your mother would be proud. I think she would. And I think she'd be proud of you too, for being willing to fight for this place, instead of just accepting defeat." Buck touched the silver brush where Maya had set it on the tackroom shelf, thinking about his grandmother's patience and his grandfather's determination, about all the people who'd invested their hopes in this land. Tomorrow would determine whether their efforts had been worthwhile, whether the next generation would have the chance to continue building on the foundation they'd laid. But tonight, watching Maya walk toward Rose's truck with the confident stride of someone who'd found her place in the world, Buck felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine optimism about the future. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, with the strength that came from refusing to surrender when something important was at stake. The silver brush gleamed in the fading light, a link between past and future that seemed to promise continuity despite uncertainty. Buck's grandmother had believed that horses and people were fundamentally the same. They responded to patience, consistency, and the faith that trust was always possible, even after everything had seemed broken beyond repair. Tomorrow, they would discover whether she'd been right. The broken bridle hung in the tackroom like a monument to failed attempts at control, its leather straps cracked and metal fittings tarnished from the years when previous trainers had tried to force Thunder into submission. Buck had kept it as a reminder of what didn't work, the old-fashioned approach that treated horses as problems to be solved rather than partnerships to be developed. This morning, as he prepared for the demonstration that would determine the ranch's future, The bridle seemed to symbolize everything they were trying to move beyond. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, with golden light stretching across pastures where more than 40 people had gathered to witness Maya's attempt to ride Thunder. Buck surveyed the crowd with a mixture of pride and anxiety, noting faces that represented different aspects of the community's support: Rosa's church friends, neighboring ranchers, representatives from rescue organizations, and the 3 potential investors Pete had mentioned. Maya emerged from the barn leading Thunder with the calm confidence that had become her trademark. But Buck caught the subtle signs of nervousness in the set of her shoulders and the careful way she moved. The Mustang seemed to sense the unusual energy surrounding them, his head higher than normal. Nostrils flared as he processed the scents and sounds of so many strangers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Buck began, his voice carrying across the paddock despite his discomfort with public speaking. "What you're about to see represents more than just a girl riding a horse. It's proof that patience and understanding can accomplish things that force and hurry cannot." He gestured toward Maya, who stood beside Thunder with the silver brush visible in her back pocket, his grandmother's gift serving as both practical tool and talisman. "Maya Torres came to our ranch 6 weeks ago carrying her own burden of loss and grief. She accepted a challenge that most people would have considered impossible, not because she was reckless, but because she understood something important about healing." The crowd listened with the respectful attention rural people reserved for stories that mattered, their faces reflecting genuine interest in the outcome. Buck noticed Jim Harrison nodding approvingly, the 3 investors taking notes, and Rosa beaming with the pride of someone whose faith in Maya had been vindicated. "The Mustang you see here was rescued 3 years ago during a winter storm," Buck continued. "Multiple professional trainers declared him untrainable. But Maya saw something different, not a problem to be solved, but a spirit that needed understanding. Maya began her routine with the methodical preparation that had become ritual, first approaching Thunder with the halter that had replaced the broken bridle. The horse accepted the gentle tack with the resignation of someone who'd learned to trust the process, his dark eyes alert but calm. The first part of the demonstration proceeded flawlessly. Maya mounted Thunder from the ground, settled into position on his back, and guided him through a series of simple movements that showcased their partnership. The Mustang responded to subtle pressure from her legs and hands, his gait smooth and controlled despite the presence of so many observers. Buck felt tension ease in his chest as applause rippled through the crowd. Maya dismounted and remounted several times, each successful exchange building confidence in both horse and rider. When she guided Thunder through a figure-8 pattern that required precise communication and trust, even the skeptical faces in the audience showed signs of impressed approval. "This is what's possible," Buck said, his voice stronger now as success seemed within reach. "When we choose patience over force, understanding over control, this ranch has the potential to help other damaged horses find their way back to partnership with humans." The crowd murmured agreement, and Buck caught Jim Harrison's enthusiastic gesture toward the investors, who seemed genuinely engaged by what they were witnessing. For the first time since receiving the foreclosure notice, Buck allowed himself to believe they might actually save the ranch. That's when he saw the familiar figure approaching from the parking area. Michael, his son, moving with the careful stride of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. Behind him walked a woman Buck didn't recognize, and a young girl with Michael's eyes and Sarah's stubborn chin. Buck felt his attention split between Maya's demonstration and his son's unexpected early arrival. Michael was supposed to come later, after the public event concluded, but here he was, with his family. Drawn perhaps by curiosity about what his father was attempting, Thunder sensed Buck's distraction immediately. Horses were exquisitely sensitive to human emotional states, and the Mustang's head came up sharply as he detected the change in atmosphere. Maya felt the shift in her mount's attention and tried to redirect his focus, but Thunder had locked onto the source of disturbance. The crisis developed with the sudden intensity of a summer storm. Thunder's nostrils flared as he processed the scent of strangers, his muscles tensing under Maya with the coiled energy of barely controlled panic. The crowd's murmur of appreciation transformed into concerned whispers as they recognized the change in the horse's demeanor. "Easy," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority that had served her so well over the past weeks. But Thunder was no longer listening to her voice alone. He was responding to the complex web of tensions and emotions that surrounded them. Buck watched helplessly as the Mustang began to dance sideways, his movements becoming increasingly erratic as fight-or-flight instincts competed with the trust Maya had so carefully built. The demonstration that had started as proof of healing and partnership was transforming into a dangerous situation that could destroy everything they'd worked to accomplish. Maya maintained her seat with the balance and composure of someone who'd spent weeks learning to read Thunder's moods, but Buck could see her growing concern as the horse's agitation increased. The crowd pressed closer, their well-meaning attention adding to the pressure that was driving Thunder toward the edge of panic. In that moment, Buck realized that success or failure depended not on Maya's riding skills or Thunder's training, but on whether the trust they'd built could withstand the test of real-world chaos. The broken bridle hanging in the tack room represented the old way of dealing with such moments, force and control imposed from outside. What Maya and Thunder had built together represented something different entirely, but whether it was strong enough to survive this crisis remained to be seen. The hand-carved wooden horse sat hidden in Buck's workshop, a secret project he'd worked on during evening hours when the ranch grew quiet, and solitude allowed for the kind of careful attention that detailed carving required. Each night for the past 2 weeks, he'd shaped the piece with tools that had belonged to his father, creating something that captured Thunder's spirit in miniature, the proud arch of neck, the intelligent eyes, the sense of barely contained power that made the Mustang so magnificent. Buck had intended to give the carving to Maya after the demonstration, regardless of outcome, as a token of his appreciation for everything she'd brought to the ranch. Now watching Thunder's increasing agitation threaten to destroy everything they'd worked toward, Buck wished he'd presented the gift earlier as a tangible reminder of the trust they'd built together. Maya felt Thunder's panic rising beneath her like a tide that threatened to sweep away weeks of patient progress. The Mustang's muscles bunched and released in waves of tension, his breathing quick and shallow as ancient instincts warred with learned trust. The crowd's concerned murmurs created a feedback loop of anxiety that pushed horse and rider closer to the edge of catastrophe. But instead of fighting Thunder's fear or attempting to impose control through force, Maya did something that surprised everyone watching. She went completely still. Her hands relaxed on the makeshift reins, her legs stopped gripping Thunder's sides, and her voice dropped to the quiet murmur she'd used during their earliest interactions. "I know," Maya said softly, her words meant for Thunder alone, but carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd. "I know you're scared, but we've been scared before, and we've gotten through it together." Buck held his breath as Maya leaned forward slightly, her posture conveying trust rather than tension. She began humming a melody he didn't recognize, perhaps something her mother had sung to her during difficult times, or maybe just sounds that came from some deeper place than conscious thought. Thunder's ears swiveled toward Maya's voice, his attention shifting from the crowd to the girl on his back. The change was subtle at first, a slight easing in his stance, a longer interval between nervous movements. But gradually, the trust they'd built over weeks of patient work began to reassert itself. "That's it," Maya continued, her voice carrying the calm authority that had gentled Thunder from the beginning. "Remember who we are together. Remember what we've learned." Buck watched his son Michael move closer to the fence, his expression showing amazement at what he was witnessing. Beside Michael, his wife held their daughter's hand while explaining in quiet tones what was happening, how the girl and horse were communicating. Through trust rather than force, the crowd seemed to understand. instinctively that they were observing something rare and precious. The murmur of conversation died away entirely, leaving only the sound of wind through grass and Maya's gentle voice as she continued working with Thunder to find their center again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Thunder's breathing deepened and his stance settled. The wild energy that had threatened to explode into chaos gradually transformed back into the controlled power that had made their partnership so impressive. Maya straightened in the saddle, her confidence returning as she felt Thunder's trust reassert itself. "Now," Maya said quietly, "let's show them what we can do." What followed was the most beautiful riding Buck had ever witnessed. Maya guided Thunder through a series of movements that showcased not just technical skill, but genuine partnership. Transitions from walk to trot to canter that flowed like music. Turns and stops that seemed to happen through telepathy rather than mechanical instruction. The crowd erupted in applause as Maya brought Thunder to a halt in the center of the paddock, both horse and rider radiating the calm satisfaction of a job well done. But Buck's attention was divided between the successful demonstration and his son's approach to the fence. "Dad," Michael said simply, his voice carrying 3 years' worth of complicated emotions. "That was incredible." Buck felt his throat tighten with feelings he'd forgotten how to express.
"She's remarkable."
"Both of them are? I can see why you—" Michael paused, searching for words. "I can see why this place matters so much to you." Buck looked at his son, noting the man Michael had become in the years since their last real conversation. The boy's features had matured into something that reminded Buck of his own father, but with a gentleness that suggested Michael had learned from the previous generation's mistakes. "I got your letter," Buck said. "I should have called sooner." "Yeah, you should have. But you called eventually, and that's what matters." Emma, Buck's granddaughter, tugged on Michael's sleeve with the impatience of childhood. "Daddy, can I pet the horse?" Buck felt his heart clench as he looked at Emma properly for the first time. Sarah's eyes, in a face that held promise of the woman she would become. 3 years was a long time in a child's life, and he'd missed so much of her growing up. "Let's ask Maya," Michael said, lifting Emma so she could see over the fence. "It's her horse now." Maya dismounted and approached the fence with Thunder following close behind, the Mustang's earlier agitation completely forgotten. When she reached the rail where Buck's family waited, she looked at Emma with the gentle attention she brought to all creatures who deserved careful handling. "Would you like to say hello to Thunder?" Maya asked. "He's very gentle when he knows you're a friend." Emma nodded solemnly, extending her small hand toward Thunder's muzzle with the fearlessness of someone too young to understand danger. The Mustang sniffed her palm carefully, then allowed the child to stroke his neck with movements that revealed an innate understanding of horses. "He likes you," Maya told Emma, who beamed with the kind of pure joy that made adults remember why simple pleasures mattered. Buck watched this scene with a fullness in his chest that felt equal parts gratitude and hope. The demonstration had succeeded beyond his expectations, but more importantly, it had created a moment where his past and future could begin to reconcile. Jim Harrison approached with the 3 investors, all of whom were talking excitedly about the potential they'd witnessed. Plans were already forming for partnerships with rescue organizations, for expanding the ranch's facilities, for creating a program that could help both horses and humans heal from trauma. "This is what we want to support," one of the investors said to Buck. "Not just the training program, but the whole approach, the patience, the understanding, the belief that broken things can be made whole again." Buck nodded, understanding that they were offering more than just financial backing. They were validating a vision of the ranch's future that honored its past while embracing new possibilities. As the crowd began to disperse, satisfied by what they'd witnessed and eager to spread word about the ranch's success, Buck found himself standing beside Maya as she cooled down Thunder. The Mustang seemed as calm and content as Buck had ever seen him, his transformation from wild, untouchable animal to trusted partner now complete. "Thank you," Buck said quietly. "For what?" for believing this was possible when I'd stopped believing it myself. Maya smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that reminded Buck how young she was, despite the wisdom and strength she'd shown. You gave me the chance to try. That's all anyone really needs, someone willing to let them attempt something worth doing. Buck thought about the wooden horse waiting in his workshop and knew the time had come to present his gift. Some gestures were too important to postpone, and some people deserved to know how much they mattered before circumstances made such acknowledgments impossible. Tonight, after the celebration died down and the ranch returned to its peaceful rhythms, Buck would give Maya the carving that represented everything she'd brought to his life: hope, healing, and the courage to believe that second chances were always possible for those brave enough to reach for them. The new ranch sign stood proud against the Montana sky, its hand-painted letters reading Hanley Torres Ranch, in script that honored both the property's history and its transformed future. Buck had commissioned the sign from a local craftsman after the adoption papers were finalized, marking Maya's transition from temporary employee to permanent family member with the kind of ceremony that important changes deserved. 6 months had passed since the demonstration that saved the ranch, and Buck still marveled at how completely his world had been transformed by a grieving teenager and an untouchable Mustang. The financial crisis that had once threatened everything now seemed like a necessary catastrophe, the kind of disaster that cleared away what wasn't working to make room for something better. The ranch operated differently now. Its mission expanded beyond cattle ranching to include a formal horse rehabilitation program that had already helped dozens of damaged animals find their way back to partnership with humans. Maya managed the program with the quiet competence that had made her success with Thunder seem inevitable in retrospect. Her natural understanding of traumatized creatures proving invaluable in developing treatment approaches that emphasized patience over force. Morning. "Dad!" Maya called from the paddock where she worked with Stella, a mare rescued from a neglect situation who'd arrived at the ranch, fearful of human contact. The word "dad" still caught Buck off guard sometimes, carrying emotional weight that made him grateful for the choice Maya had made to become part of his family legally as well as practically. "How's she doing today?" Buck asked, joining Maya at the fence where Stella stood accepting gentle brushing with the resignation of someone learning to trust again. "Better. She let me pick up her front feet yesterday, which means she's starting to believe I won't hurt her. Give her another month and she'll be ready for adoption." Buck watched Maya work with Stella, noting the same patient consistency that had won Thunder's trust. The Mustang himself had become something of a legend in the local horse community, his transformation from wild, untouchable animal to gentle teacher, inspiring others to believe that healing was possible even in the most difficult cases. Thunder now served as a therapy horse for children dealing with trauma, his story of survival and recovery offering hope to young people who'd lost faith in their own ability to heal. Maya had developed a program that paired damaged horses with struggling kids, creating partnerships that helped both species learn to trust again. "Rosa's coming for lunch," Maya said, finishing with Stella and moving toward the tack room where Buck's grandmother's silver brush held a place of honor among the ranch's most valued tools. "She's bringing her famous tamales and news about the church's fundraiser for the children's riding program." Buck smiled at the mention of Rosa, who'd become an integral part of their extended family. Her visits brought warmth and laughter to the ranch, along with homemade food that reminded Maya of her mother's cooking and connected her to cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The kitchen had been remodeled over the winter, expanded to accommodate the larger household that now included Maya as permanent resident and frequent visits from Michael's family. Emma spent weekends at the ranch, learning to ride and helping with the horses, her fearless enthusiasm reminding Buck of his own children at that age. The framed photograph on the kitchen table showed Maya, Buck, and Thunder at the moment of their first successful ride, but it was surrounded now by newer pictures, Emma on her first pony, Michael and his wife helping with fence repair, Rosa teaching Maya to make her grandmother's bread recipe. The collection told the story of a family that had grown beyond blood relationships to encompass everyone who'd chosen to be part of the ranch's mission. "I've been thinking about my mother a lot lately," Maya said as they walked toward the house together. "Wondering what she'd think about all this. What do you think she'd say?" Maya was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the thoughtfulness she brought to all important matters. "I think she'd say that healing doesn't mean forgetting what hurt you. It means learning to carry that hurt in a way that makes you stronger instead of smaller." Buck understood. His own healing had required accepting responsibility for the choices that had damaged his relationships with his children, while also forgiving himself enough to try building something better. Sarah's death had been a loss that could never be undone, but supporting her through those final years had been the right choice, despite its financial cost. The afternoon brought the familiar rhythm of ranch work, feeding horses, checking fences, planning for the spring breeding season that would bring new life to the property. Maya moved through these tasks with the efficiency of someone who'd found her natural element, her competence with animals extending to machinery, and business management in ways that suggested she'd inherited more than just her grandfather's horse sense. "The university extension program wants to document our rehabilitation methods," Maya said as they finished the day's work. "They think what we're doing here could be replicated at other ranches." Buck felt pride swell in his chest at the recognition Maya's work was receiving. The program she'd developed combined traditional horse training techniques with insights drawn from trauma therapy, creating an approach that addressed not just behavioral problems, but the emotional wounds that caused them. "That mean you'll be traveling to teach workshops?" "Some, but this will always be home base. Thunder and I, we belong here." Buck looked toward the pasture where Thunder grazed with the other horses, his dark coat gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The Mustang had retained his magnificent spirit while learning to channel it toward helping others, becoming living proof that strength and gentleness could coexist. As evening settled over the ranch, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Buck why his grandfather had chosen this place, he found himself thinking about legacy in ways that went beyond property and blood relationships. The ranch would continue beyond his lifetime, but not as a simple inheritance passed from father to son. Instead, it had become something larger, a place where damaged things could heal, where trust could be rebuilt, where the belief that broken spirits could be made whole again was proven true, one horse and one person at a time. Maya appeared beside him at the fence, carrying the wooden horse he'd carved for her during those anxious weeks before the demonstration. She kept it on her desk now, a reminder of the moment when a sarcastic challenge had become a genuine invitation to join something meaningful. "Thank you," Maya said quietly, as she had every evening since the adoption papers were signed. "For what this time?" Maya smiled, the expression carrying all the warmth and confidence she'd gained over the months of building trust with horses and humans alike. "For believing that someone like me could belong somewhere like this." Buck put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, understanding that belonging was always a choice, not just the choice to stay, but the choice to invest yourself fully in something larger than your own needs. Maya had made that choice, and in doing so had shown him that the most profound connections really could happen between the most unlikely people. The new ranch sign caught the last light of day, its letters spelling out a future that honored the past, while embracing possibilities Buck had never imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, horses that needed healing, people who needed hope, the ongoing work of building something that would last beyond any single lifetime. But tonight, watching his daughter work with Thunder in the gathering dusk, Buck felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he'd helped create something worth preserving. Sometimes the most beautiful things really were worth taking risks for, and sometimes broken souls really could find healing through an untamed horse and each other.